The following tutorial will cover the topics of personal responsibility with regards to accessing, reading, interpreting and applying legislation, as well as looking at current and point-in-time versions of legislation, and also how to track changes and amendments to legislation. The first of the topics that we're going to cover is personal responsibility. As a professional real estate agent, you're expected to know more about the law and its application than, of course, the people you represent and advise, being your clients, and also the people that you introduce to your clients, so your buyers and tenants. You also have to be aware that ignorance of the law is not an excuse that you can use for not knowing the legislation. There are a number of steps associated with taking personal responsibility. These are accessing the legislation, followed by reading the legislation. So accessing the legislation. The first step in doing this is determining whether or not the legislation you need to access is federal or state. Federal legislation is also known as commonwealth legislation. It is relevant to all of Australia, to all industries. If I want to access legislation which is federal, I would go to the website for the Federal Register of Legislation, located at www.legislation.gov.au. State legislation is state specific, so that means it's going to be relevant to New South Wales in our case, and to real estate in New South Wales. To locate the legislation which is state specific for New South Wales, the website would be legislation.nsw.gov.au. You can also access legislation for other states in exactly the same way by changing out the NSW to the corresponding state. One other way that you can access legislation is using a tool which is also a website called Legify, located at www.legify.com.au. We're going to go to more depth in each of these sites to show you how you would actually access the legislation that you require. Let's assume that you want to access a Commonwealth legislation, being the Privacy Act 1988. So we are on the legislation.gov.au website, which is that of the Federal Register of Legislation. The next step is looking at the area of acts in force. So we want to click into that area and we will be greeted by an alphabetical order of different acts that we have. Because we're looking for privacy, we're going to head down for P and PR, and this will open the section for the relevant legislation. Scrolling down the list will give us access to the source documentation, being the Privacy Act 1988, and we can see that it is in force, latest version, and we now have access to this legislation firsthand. State-specific legislation is done in the same way. So to get New South Wales legislation, I am on legislation.nsw.gov.au website. From here, I need to go into the Browse section, and once again, I need to look at the Acts in Force. We're going to assume that we are looking for the Property and Stock Agents Act 2002. So we're going to go to P for Property and Stock Agents Act, scroll down the list to find the relevant legislation. I can then click into it, and once again, I can access the legislation firsthand. From here, I can also click on regulations, which means I will now be able to access the corresponding Property and Stock Agents Regulation 2014 from here as well. The final way of accessing legislation that we're going to look at for this video is using the tool Legify. So it's located at www.legify.com.au, And as you can see on the side, it says Legify helps you find the authoritative or as close to authoritative as possible version of almost 14,000 Australian acts and regulations instantly and direct from the legislation publishers of Commonwealth, states and territories. So all you have to do is start typing a keyword in this area for the legislation that you're seeking, and it will give you all of the available options for your search results. So let's imagine once again that we're going to be looking for legislation that's relevant to property. So we can start typing our property as our keyword, and we can then select from here that we want all of the Commonwealth legislation that comes under this topic, as well as New South Wales legislation. And you can see the list that comes up for current legislation for the topic. You can see that there is the Property and Stock Agents Act 2002 and also the Property and Stock Agents Regulation 2014, as well as others. We have now covered the topic of accessing the legislation. The next step that we need to address is reading the legislation as part of your personal responsibility. At one time or other during your real estate career, you will need to access and read the relevant legislation. So you may come across some issues relevant to the Privacy Act or not understanding how to apply information associated with the Privacy Act, and so you may need to access the Privacy Act 1988, read the information to get more of an understanding of what your requirements under this legislation are. Some other federal legislation that would be useful reading include the Competition and Consumer Act, Sex Discrimination Act, Disability Discrimination Act, Work Health and Safety Act, among others. Of course, when it comes to state legislation, two of the most important pieces of legislation that you will want to read include the Property and Stock Agents Act 2002 and the Property and Stock Agents Regulation 2014, both of which are going to be relevant to working in the real estate industry in the various roles, including being assistant agent or a real estate agent, Class 1 and Class 2. You will also need to be aware of the Residential Tenancies Act and Regulation, particularly if you're going to be working as a property manager, and Fair Trading Act and Regulation as some. And now this is not an exhaustive list of the legislation, but the most important thing to consider is knowing where to access it as the time arises that you have a need for it is going to get you quite far into the process of being able to get you onto the right path of being able to read the correct legislation. After reading the legislation, the next step is to interpret what it actually means. So let's look at how we do this. Many people become overwhelmed with the topic of legislation. It is, after all, quite a complex topic, with having to understand to read Principal Act, and then there's regulations, and then there's references to other pieces of legislation which have got an interrelationship. It's no wonder that it can be confusing. So there are some aids to interpreting the legislation. The first we'll look at is internal aids or intrinsic aids, and these are matters within the Act itself which may help make the meaning clearer. So for example, the Act itself may have a definition section, and that's to be used for the purpose of explaining how certain terms within the legislation are to be applied to get an understanding of what those terms mean. Extrinsic or external aids are also another way of assisting with interpreting legislation, and these are materials that don't form part of an Act itself, but which may assist in the interpretation of the Act and may help put an Act into context. So you have external aids such as interpretation acts, so an Act to actually tell you how to interpret, and you have other various extrinsic aids that you can utilize as well. More of this topic is covered in the relevant learner guide if you want to read into more depth on this. The last area that we're going to touch on is probably the easiest one for you to access, and that is specialist advice. So in order to fully understand relevant legislation, you may need to seek guidance from a statutory body who enforces the Act, industry association, or legal practitioner who specialises in that field. So when we're looking at statutory body who enforces the Act, the example of this in our case for New South Wales would be the Office of Fair Trading. The industry association group or industry body would be the Real Estate Institute of Australia or Real Estate Institute of New South Wales. And then, of course, the legal practitioner who specialises in the field of real estate can be another good way for you to access relevant information from someone who specialises in the field. Now that we understand how to interpret the legislation that we're reading, or that we've been able to go and get guidance of how to understand how to apply the legislation, the last thing left to do is to in fact apply the legislation. So when we're talking about the application of the legislation, it's simply making sure that your day-to-day activity that you're engaging in complies with what the legislation specifies that you must do. The next topic we're going to look at is currency and point-in-time versions of legislation. So under this topic, it is very important to ensure that the legislation that we are accessing is the most up-to-date version, and that you're not accessing a superseded version of the legislation without knowing it, and then meaning you could be breaching the legislation. Each legislation website includes version currency on each relevant piece of legislation. Therefore, accessing the direct source to make certain the version is current will prevent mistakes of application of superseded legislation. So sometimes we find that people will go and do a Google search for a topic. That's not going to ensure that you're accessing the most current version of legislation. So once again, we would go to either the New South Wales legislation website if it was going to be a state-specific act that we were interested in, or if we wanted to look at Commonwealth legislation, what we're going to look at next is going to follow a similar process. We are now going to look at currency and point-in-time versions of legislation. So the New South Wales legislation website has recently been changed to how you previously viewed this information. However, I think it's perhaps a little bit simpler to understand in this format. So you can see when you have got the Property and Stock Agents Act 2002 open that you've got this timeline which says point-in-time versions. So all the way from the historical version through to the current version being the 14th of the 5th, 2020, which is the most up-to-date. Also, the clues in the title where you can see that it says current version for 14th of May 2020 to date, and accessed on the 2nd of September 2020, which is me accessing it today. If I scroll a little bit further down, once again in the status information we can see currency of version is that the current version is the 14th of May 2020 to date. And legislation on the site is updated within 3 working days after change to legislation has been made. So that's just as simple as that to work out whether or not you are looking at a current version of legislation or not. In the next section, we're going to be looking at how we track amendments to the legislation to assist in the understanding of how we get to the 14th of the 5th being the current legislation. The final topic for this video is tracking legislative changes and amendments. Tracking changes and amendments to legislation will ensure that you continue to comply with the legislation at all times, and in turn avoid hefty fines as well as possible disciplinary action. So periodically checking New South Wales Fair Trading website can be one way of tracking your changes to anything that is relevant to real estate. That, of course, is not going to allow you to be aware of any changes for Commonwealth legislation. The other way that you can track changes is also by going to the New South Wales legislation website to look at the main page, and we'll have a look at this shortly to have a look at what's currently been changed or what legislative changes we need to be aware of for the week. And the same would apply for the Federal Register of Legislation. But for this particular topic, we're going to look specifically at New South Wales legislation and also the Fair Trading website. So let's have a look at some changes to legislation. One of the ways that we can do this is to go to the New South Wales legislation homepage. And you can see on the homepage, under the notice board information, and then on the right-hand side, this week, published to website from Monday, are all of the changes to legislation for the week. So that's all the bills, both government and non-government ones, any as made legislation in force, acts, statutory instruments, etc. You can see these little atom feeds on the side, which allows you to also subscribe for alerts to specific legislation should you wish for to be alerted. Let's say, however, that you want to look at specifically any changes relevant to Property and Stock Agents Act, because if I have a look through the list of government bills, I can have a quick look to see if there are any acts that stand out to me that are going to be relevant to real estate, but it's not always clear whether these have any implication for real estate. So if I go into in-force legislation and look up once again our Property and Stock Agents Act, I can then have a look specifically within that legislation to see if there are any new changes I need to be aware of. And to do that, I click on Legislative History, and then I can go under List of Legislation and Amending Legislation. So you've got List of Legislation, then Amending Legislation. And at the very top, you can see that that is the most current change, which was assented to on the 14th of the 5th, 2020, which coincides directly with us having a look at our Property and Stock Agents Act when we have a look at before, our statutory instrument being our parent act, that we want to have a look at, Property and Stock Agents Act. You can see that the current version was the 14th of May 2020. So from the legislative history, the amending legislation, the COVID-19 legislation amendment, was the last change made that's relevant to that legislation, and that's how we've come to the 14th of the 5th, 2020 being the current version. Another way we can look at changes to legislation is by going to the New South Wales Government Office of Fair Trading website, and from there we can look at the link of changes to legislation. And here is where Office of Fair Trading will list all of the changes to legislation that have occurred, and also because it's coming from the Office of Fair Trading, they provide a little bit more information about how to understand the recent changes to the laws. So if I scroll down, I can see here that there is an information section on changes to residential tenancy laws, and because we're working in real estate, that of course would be relevant. So I can open that and then read up on the changes here as well.